Now it's time to render our scene. So, we're going to talk about the render settings that we need to use in order to render with Arnold. First, let's open up our render settings. It's this little clapboard with the cog in front of it. Usually cogs represent some form of settings. So we'll open that up. You'll see it's currently set to Hardware 2.0, and there's other videos in this series that show you how to render with Hardware 2.0. Hardware 2.0 is always going to give you a much poorer render quality. So let's just go ahead and change this to the Arnold renderer. And by default, most of this is going to be pretty close to correct, but let's just go ahead and make sure we have everything set correctly anyway. First, we want to make sure that our file name prefix is set to something that we will recognize and something that does not have a number in it. Right, so we can call this bridge render, or we could call this Arnold render, so we will know what the name of this is. And you'll see that when we make changes to this and click out of here, we will see updates up here to this information. And this information tells you a lot. It tells you the place that Arnold is rendering, or that Maya is rendering these images to. Right? It's rendering it to my bridge folder and to my images folder. And it also tells you how it's going to name them. Arnold render 0001.exr through 120.exr. Now the reason it's rendering that sequence, yours may not say that. Yours may say this instead, and it's just going to render it as Arnold render, right? And the reason for that is because you have to change under metadata name type value this frame animation extension. So if I click on this, you'll see that this is how it intends to name the files, right? And right now, if it's just the name, then it's not going. You can't do a sequence that way. These are only for single frame renders. So we got to choose one of these down here at the bottom that doesn't say single frame with it. Usually what I like is name with the underscore, the number, and then the extension. Okay, the extension is like your JPEG or your GIF or your PNG, right? In this case, the extension type is an EXR. Okay. Now you've probably not used an EXR before, and only certain programs can open an EXR. But an EXR is an image. It's like a JPEG or a PNG, except it contains a lot more information than JPEGs or PNGs. One of the other things you're going to need to do is make sure that you have written down in here the time range you want to render from. So I want to render from frame 1 to frame 120. And I want to make sure that I'm using my render cam, not rendering from the perspective. Otherwise, Arnold's going to render from the wrong camera for the entire render. So I'll make sure that's set to render cam or whatever camera you animated and want to render from. The final thing is you want to make sure that your preset is set to HD 1080 right here. That's going to be the HD file format that you need to get the best quality of render out of this. If it's set to HD 540, it's going to render a tiny image that you can barely see. So let's talk just a little bit more. Let's go and set this back to 1080. Let's talk just a little bit more about our render quality and our render speed. Okay. If I were to hit play on this render right now, it will render relatively quickly. You'll see down here at the bottom, it's rendering from the wrong camera, so make sure I'll just try to get it to catch up. There we go. Now it's rendering from the correct camera. You'll see it's rendering relatively quickly, and when I say relatively quickly, I mean it's going to be less than a minute a frame, right? But the final image quality is not going to be the best in the world. We're going to see some grain in here happening, and that's going to happen for a couple of reasons. But recognize that this is just rendering one image. Right? We have to render 120 of them. So this is where this becomes another element you have to work with in order to get a reasonably fast render that that still looks good. And there's a couple of things that we can do to make that happen. So first, I can make this render look a little bit better by selecting my lights. So I have my light up here, and changing the number of samples that are being cast by this light. So if I change this to something like 3 or 5, right? Not 35, but like, let's say 5, and I do the same with my sky dome, and I change that to 5, I'm going to get a much better render. It's going to have much less of this this grain happening in here, right? And this grain is samples that we're changing is basically saying how many little packets of light are these lights sending out, and and those little packets of light are colliding with the environment, and that's why we can see them. Well, if it's sending out a small number of them, then some of them are missing, and we're getting these little dark areas, right? The higher that number is on our samples for each of the light, the more packets of light it will send out. And so our render will be a lot nicer, but it will take longer to render that image. So we can open up a calculator and do the math, but if we have 120 frames and it is taking 1 minute to render every frame, then we're looking at 2 hours to render our entire animation. Okay? Recognize that this is not uncommon. It's not uncommon for an animation to take days to render. And so you definitely need to be allotting time or planning for render time. So there are things we can do to kind of make this render happen a little faster. Right? One is to turn those samples back down. Right? Maybe I didn't need 5, maybe I just needed 3. And we can do test renders to see if that is speeding it up enough or not. I'll do 3 on both of those, and once this render is done, we will see it'll tell you the render time for that.